Hey guys, what made Edwardian womanhood so strange was not simply that it was formal, but that so much of ordinary life had to be turned into performance. A visit, a meal, a walk into a room, even the angle of a hat or the timing of a card could quietly announce whether a woman was considered polished, careless, respectable, ambitious, or socially dangerous. Before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support the channel. Subscribe as well if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past. To understand why these rules mattered so much, it helps to begin with a small correction. Edwardian etiquette was not merely a collection of silly manners invented by idle people with too much time. It could certainly look absurd, and sometimes it was absurd, but it was also a social technology. In the Britain of Edward VII's reign, and in the years immediately after, rules of conduct helped people read one another almost instantly. They signaled class, upbringing, respectability, family discipline, and self-command. For women especially, etiquette was never just about being pleasant. It was about being legible. It told the world what kind of woman one was supposed to be, and just as importantly, what kind of woman one was not. The result was a world in which the smallest details of behavior carried far more meaning than many modern people would expect. That is part of what makes the Edwardian period so interesting for modern viewers. From a distance, it can appear elegant, even glamorous. Pale dresses, polished silver, luncheon tables, opera cloaks, seaside holidays, and carefully photographed society weddings. But elegance in this world was often built on management, rehearsal, and restraint. There were rules for receiving guests, rules for being introduced, rules for writing invitations, rules for dining, rules for mourning, and rules for travel. A well-born woman was not supposed to move through society casually, as though life were spontaneous. She was expected to move through it correctly. And correctly did not just mean morally. It meant socially, visually, rhythmically. It meant knowing the invisible script. One of the clearest examples was the world of visiting and calling. To modern eyes, leaving a card may sound like a decorative custom, the sort of thing remembered only in old novels. In the Edwardian social world, it was closer to a system of controlled access. Calls were not always casual drops-in. They were structured acts that acknowledged rank, acquaintance, and obligation. A hostess might be at home on a particular afternoon. Guests might leave cards in a tray before entering. Those unable to attend could send cards instead. Even the act of arrival had order to it. These rituals gave shape to social life, but they also filtered it. A woman could not simply circulate freely without regard for these signals unless she was willing to be read as careless, overly eager, or badly taught. In that sense, etiquette did not merely decorate society. It regulated entry into it. And the burden of that regulation fell especially heavily on women because women were so often cast as the moral surface of the household. A man might be judged for money, office, education, or public authority. A woman was very often judged first through conduct. Her posture, voice, dress, greeting, timing, and conversational tact could be read as evidence of upbringing not only in herself, but in her family. This is one reason the rules could feel so relentless. They were presented as refinements of taste, but underneath them sat fear. Fear of vulgarity, fear of social embarrassment, fear of seeming too bold, too visible, too interested, too decorative, too cold, or not refined enough. Etiquette promised safety from that embarrassment, but only if one mastered an exhausting amount of detail. Even clothing was not simply clothing. It was behavior made visible. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women's dress had long been shaped by structured undergarments, and although silhouettes were changing by the Edwardian years, the expectation remained that the body itself should appear controlled, composed, and properly presented. Garments were not merely decorative. They trained movement. Certain skirts shortened stride. Corsetry affected posture and breath. Gloves, hats, collars, and layers of fabric created a public self that had to be maintained from the moment one was seen. It is easy to think of fashion as freedom for the wealthy, but in this world it was often a discipline, and much of etiquette was really about making that discipline look effortless. Gloves are a good example because they seem minor until one notices how often they appear. In accounts of Edwardian manners, gloves were not incidental accessories. They were part of the grammar of respectability. One modern museum summary of Edwardian manners notes that women did not remove gloves in public, a small fact that reveals a great deal. Gloves helped create distance. They softened direct contact. They kept the public body properly mediated. They were part cleanliness, part decorum, part class signal. To remain gloved was to remain slightly armored. And that is one of the quiet truths beneath many etiquette rules for women in this era. The ideal woman was expected to be socially present, but never too exposed. Conversation itself was governed in similar ways. A successful Edwardian woman was not expected to dominate a room with personality in the modern sense. She was expected to keep social exchange smooth. At formal meals, even topics of conversation might be anticipated in advance by a careful hostess. That detail sounds comic now, but it points toward something serious. Spontaneity was not always considered a virtue in high society. The purpose of good conversation was not radical honesty or self-expression. It was control without strain. A woman had to be agreeable without seeming empty, informed without seeming aggressive, witty without becoming loud, and warm without inviting the wrong kind of intimacy. She was expected to reveal character while showing almost no friction at all. This balancing act became especially delicate around men. Much of Edwardian etiquette was built around managing contact between unmarried women and the wider world. Not because women were literally hidden away in all circumstances, but because reputation was still treated as something fragile and collective. It attached not only to a woman herself, but to her family's standing and future. Seemingly small rules about introductions, visiting, chaperonage, correspondence, and the length or tone of interaction all existed to prevent ambiguity. Ambiguity was dangerous because ambiguity invited interpretation, and interpretation could become gossip. In that world, a woman's freedom was often narrowed not only by law or economics, but by the constant need to remain beyond suspicious interpretation. Etiquette served as a protective shell, but it was also a cage made to look graceful. That is where the real contradiction begins to emerge. Edwardian society liked to describe these customs as civilizing, uplifting, and dignified. In some ways they were. They reduced open conflict. They gave strangers a common code. They made shared rituals possible. But they also consumed attention that might otherwise have gone elsewhere. An enormous amount of female energy could be spent on minute self-regulation, on cards sent at the proper time, sleeves fit for the hour, the correct level of gratitude to show, the proper sequence of entering a room, or the safe tone to adopt in conversation. A rule that looked trivial in isolation could become heavy when multiplied across every day of adult life. And yet the system endured because it did make sense to the people living inside it. That is an important point, and one modern viewers often miss. Etiquette was not simply imposed from above by villains in drawing rooms. It was sustained by thousands of people who believed, often sincerely, that good manners protected order, spared others discomfort, and preserved standards in a rapidly changing world. The Edwardian period was not static. Class tensions were real. Women's roles were under pressure. Consumer culture was expanding. Cities were growing. Travel was faster. Public visibility was changing. In a society that felt both confident and unstable, etiquette gave the illusion that all the right boundaries still held. The more modern life accelerated, the more some people clung to visible forms of restraint. That is also why these rules often became stricter, not looser, in exactly the environments that looked most luxurious. Think of the formal afternoon tea, the country house dinner, the fashionable voyage, the carefully managed season. These settings appear leisurely, but they were thick with scrutiny. On ocean travel, for instance, elite women were advised to dress with an acute awareness of being seen at moments of embarkation and arrival. Travel was not a break from presentation. It was another stage for it. The same was true at home. Dining was performance. Visiting was performance. Even stillness could be performance. The elegant Edwardian woman did not merely exist in public. She was expected to compose an image of seamless appropriateness almost wherever she went. The deeper irony, of course, is that a culture so devoted to correctness was full of uncertainty beneath the surface. This was the age in which women were pressing against older limits, entering public debate more forcefully, engaging more visibly with politics, education, work, and reform. The ideal of the perfectly mannered woman remained powerful, but it was already being strained by the modern world around it, which meant etiquette was not only preserving a social order. It was quietly revealing how anxious that order had become. And once that anxiety enters the picture, the rules start to look less quaint and more revealing. They tell us not just how Edwardian women were supposed to behave, but what Edwardian society was afraid might happen if they behaved otherwise. In the next part, that becomes even clearer when we move from the general language of manners into the specific rituals that governed introductions, courtship, public presence, dining, and the daily discipline of seeming effortlessly proper. And once those anxieties begin to shape behavior, the rules stop feeling ornamental and start to feel almost strategic, especially in the delicate business of introductions. In Edwardian society, an introduction was never a casual moment. It was a controlled act, often managed by a third party, and it carried consequences that could extend well beyond a single conversation. A woman could not simply approach a stranger and begin speaking without risking misinterpretation. Instead, introductions established legitimacy. They answered, silently but firmly, the question of whether two people were meant to know each other at all. Without that small but formal bridge, even a polite exchange could feel improper, as though it had skipped an essential step in the social order. This mattered most in the context of men and women meeting, where the stakes were understood to be higher. A properly conducted introduction suggested that the connection had been vetted, that both individuals belonged, at least loosely, within the same acceptable social sphere. It provided a kind of safety but also a constraint, because once introduced, there were expectations. How often one might speak, whether a call should follow, how the relationship should be interpreted by others. An introduction did not open unlimited freedom. It opened a narrow, carefully defined path. Courtship itself, then, unfolded inside these narrow paths. Contrary to many modern assumptions, romance in this period was rarely spontaneous in the public sense. It was structured, observed, and often quietly negotiated through layers of etiquette. A young woman was not expected to pursue attention openly. In fact, too much visible enthusiasm could damage her standing. Instead, she was meant to receive attention gracefully, to respond without appearing eager, and to allow interactions to develop under the supervision, or at least the awareness, of others. This created a peculiar tension. On one hand, the system was designed to protect reputations and prevent impulsive or inappropriate connections. On the other, it required a great deal of subtle performance. Interest had to be signaled without being declared. Affection had to be implied without being confirmed. Even something as simple as the length of a conversation, or the frequency of an exchange at a gathering, could carry meaning that both parties were expected to understand without stating directly. And nowhere was that quiet language more visible than in the choreography of public appearances. When a woman entered a room, she did not simply arrive. She appeared within a sequence. Her introduction, her greeting, her placement, even the order in which she acknowledged others, all formed part of a pattern that had been learned over years. A misstep here was not catastrophic, but it could be noticed. And being noticed in the wrong way was often what etiquette was trying to prevent. Dining, for instance, was not merely about eating. It was one of the most structured social environments a woman would regularly inhabit. Seating arrangements were rarely random. They were deliberate, often reflecting hierarchy, compatibility, or the subtle management of relationships. Once seated, the rules continued. How one held utensils, how one spoke, when one spoke, how much attention one gave to neighbors on either side. All of this contributed to the overall impression. Even the act of beginning and ending a meal was guided by expectation. A woman did not simply decide when she was finished. She moved with the rhythm of the table. She adjusted herself to the host's signals, to the pace of courses, to the collective atmosphere. And beneath all of this was the same quiet demand, to make it look effortless. The more structured the environment, the more invisible that structure was supposed to appear. It is at this point that the emotional cost of these systems becomes easier to see. Not because every moment was tense or uncomfortable, but because so many moments required attention. There was very little room for complete relaxation in public spaces. Even leisure had rules. Even enjoyment had boundaries. A woman might laugh, but not too loudly. She might speak, but not too freely. She might express preference, but not in a way that suggested stubbornness or dominance. This does not mean that Edwardian women were passive or without agency. In fact, many became highly skilled at navigating these expectations, using them to shape outcomes in subtle ways. A carefully timed visit could strengthen a connection. A perfectly worded note could repair a misunderstanding. A well-managed conversation could influence opinion without appearing forceful. Etiquette, in this sense, was not only restrictive. It could also be a tool, though one that required precision and patience to use effectively. Still, the boundaries remained firm, especially in moments where visibility increased. Public outings, for example, carried their own set of expectations. Walking in a busy area, attending an event, or even being seen at the right place at the right time required careful judgment. A woman was not expected to be invisible, but she was expected to be appropriate. And appropriateness was not fixed. It shifted depending on context, company, and setting. This is where the idea of reputation becomes central again. Reputation in Edwardian society was not built only on major events or clear actions. It accumulated through countless small observations. Someone noticed how a woman greeted a guest. Someone else noticed how often she appeared in certain company. Another might note her tone, her dress, her timing. None of these details alone defined her, but together they formed a picture. And once that picture began to circulate, it could be difficult to change. Because of this, even written communication was treated with caution. Letters, invitations, and responses were expected to follow specific forms, not simply for politeness, but for clarity. A phrase that seemed too informal might suggest overfamiliarity. A delay in response might imply indifference or disrespect. A tone that felt too direct might be read as lacking refinement. Writing, like speech, had to strike a careful balance between warmth and restraint. And yet, for all this control, there were moments when the system revealed its own limitations. Situations arose that did not fit neatly into established patterns. Encounters that felt genuine but awkward within formal rules. Emotions that resisted careful phrasing. Social shifts that made older customs feel increasingly strained. In these moments, etiquette could become not just a guide, but a point of tension. This tension was particularly visible as new ideas about women's roles began to circulate more widely. Education, employment, political participation, and public voice were all slowly expanding, even if unevenly. The ideal of the perfectly managed, perfectly composed woman remained powerful, but it was no longer uncontested. And as that ideal was questioned, even quietly, the rules that supported it began to feel heavier, more noticeable, and in some cases more difficult to sustain. Which leads into one of the most revealing areas of Edwardian etiquette, where these pressures became almost impossible to ignore: the rituals surrounding appearance in transitional moments, arrivals, departures, public acknowledgments, and the subtle but loaded expectations placed on women when they were most visibly entering or leaving the social stage. And in those transitional moments, when a woman was most visibly entering or leaving the social stage, the pressure to appear correct became almost distilled into its purest form. Arrival, for instance, was never just a physical act. It was a statement made in motion. The timing of one's entrance mattered more than it might seem. To arrive too early could suggest eagerness, even a lack of other engagements. To arrive too late could appear careless, or worse, dismissive of the host. So a narrow window formed, an unspoken expectation that one would arrive neither first nor last, but at a moment that suggested both respect and composure. Within that small window, a woman's sense of timing became another quiet measure of her social understanding. The moment of stepping into a room carried its own choreography. There was a way of pausing just enough to acknowledge the space, a way of greeting the hostess before allowing oneself to be drawn into conversation, a way of being seen without appearing to seek attention. Even the angle of the head, the pace of the step, the balance between confidence and modesty, these were not consciously rehearsed in every instance, but they were learned patterns, absorbed over time until they felt almost instinctive. And yet, that instinct was not entirely natural. It was cultivated, often from a young age, through observation and correction. A girl growing up in a household that valued these rules would watch how older women moved, how they greeted visitors, how they managed silence as much as speech. She would be gently guided, sometimes more firmly corrected, until her own movements aligned with those expectations. By the time she entered society herself, much of this behavior would feel automatic, though it had been carefully shaped over years. Departure carried a similar weight, though in a slightly different tone. Leaving a gathering required its own awareness. One did not simply slip away unnoticed, nor did one make a display of leaving. There was a balance to be struck, a quiet acknowledgement of the host, perhaps a brief exchange, and then a controlled exit that did not disrupt the ongoing rhythm of the room. To linger too long at the moment of departure could be awkward. To leave too abruptly could be interpreted as cold. Once again, the correct path lay somewhere in between, in that narrow band of behavior that signaled both appreciation and restraint. These moments of arrival and departure reveal something deeper about Edwardian etiquette. They show that the rules were not only about interaction, but about visibility itself. Being seen was not neutral, carried meaning, and so the act of becoming visible, entering a room, stepping into a public space, presenting oneself at a gathering, had to be managed with care. Public acknowledgement worked in a similar way. A woman might encounter acquaintances in the street, in a park, or at a social venue, and the question of whether to acknowledge them and how was not always straightforward. A nod, a slight bow of the head, a brief smile, or a more extended greeting could each carry different implications. Too much familiarity in a public setting might be seen as improper, particularly if the acquaintance was not close. Too little acknowledgement could be interpreted as arrogance or intentional slight. This delicate balance was complicated further by the presence of others. An interaction that might be entirely appropriate in a private setting could feel different when observed. And so women learned to adjust their behavior not only to the person they were addressing, but to the wider audience that might be watching, even casually. In this way, etiquette extended beyond direct interaction into a kind of ambient awareness, a constant reading of context and perception. Travel offered another stage on which these expectations played out. Railway stations, for example, were spaces of movement and transition, but they were also highly visible environments. A woman traveling alone might attract attention, and so her conduct in such spaces had to signal propriety without appearing defensive. She might be accompanied, or she might rely on the visible markers of respectability, dress, posture, demeanor, to establish her position within the social order. Even the act of boarding or disembarking carried its own expectations. There was a way of moving that suggested calm control, a way of handling luggage, of acknowledging assistance, of settling into a compartment. These details might seem small, but they formed part of the larger impression a woman gave. And in a society where impressions mattered deeply, these small acts accumulated into something more significant. It is worth pausing here to consider how much of this was internalized. By the Edwardian period, many of these rules no longer required explicit instruction in every situation. They had become part of the cultural fabric, passed down through observation, reinforced through subtle feedback. A raised eyebrow, a slight pause in conversation, a change in tone. These could all signal that something had not been quite right. Over time, women learned to anticipate these signals, adjusting their behavior before correction was needed. And yet, this internalization did not remove the pressure. If anything, it made it more constant. When rules are external, they can sometimes be ignored or challenged. When they are internalized, they become part of one's own sense of correctness. A misstep is no longer just a breach of etiquette. It can feel like a personal failure, a lapse in judgment or discipline. This is where the emotional texture of Edwardian etiquette becomes more complex. It was not simply restrictive in a physical sense. It shaped how women understood themselves, how they measured their own success in social life. To be considered well-mannered was not just to follow rules. It was to embody a certain ideal of composure, awareness, and restraint. At the same time, the very precision of these expectations created space for subtle distinction. Within a room full of properly behaved individuals, small differences could stand out. A slightly more graceful movement, a more thoughtful response, a better sense of timing. These could elevate a woman's standing without breaking any rules. In this sense, etiquette was not only about conformity. It allowed for a kind of quiet competition, where refinement itself became a form of distinction. But that competition could be exhausting, particularly when combined with the broader changes taking place in Edwardian society. As new opportunities and expectations began to emerge, women found themselves navigating not just one set of rules, but overlapping and sometimes conflicting ones. The ideal of perfect composure did not always align easily with the realities of a world that was becoming more dynamic, more public, and in some ways more uncertain. And it is in that overlap between established etiquette and emerging change that some of the most revealing contradictions appear. Because even as women were expected to maintain a carefully managed public presence, they were also beginning to step into roles that required a different kind of visibility, a different kind of voice. The question of how to reconcile these demands did not always have a clear answer. Which is why, as we move further into the Edwardian period, the rules themselves begin to tell a slightly different story, not just about how women were expected to behave, but about how those expectations were quietly being tested in spaces where etiquette could no longer fully contain what was beginning to change. The rules did not simply disappear. They became more revealing, more strained, and in some cases, more quietly negotiable. One of the clearest places this tension surfaced was in the management of time itself. Edwardian etiquette had always placed a great deal of importance on timing, when to call, when to reply, when to arrive, when to leave. But as women's lives began to expand beyond purely domestic or social routines, time became less predictable. A woman who attended lectures, participated in charitable work, or involved herself in early professional roles could not always conform to the rigid windows that older customs assumed. And yet, the expectation of punctuality, of responsiveness, of social availability did not vanish. This created a subtle but persistent friction. A delayed reply to an invitation might once have suggested indifference. Now, it might simply reflect a crowded schedule. A missed afternoon call might once have been a slight. Now, it might be the result of obligations that earlier generations had not faced. Etiquette, in this sense, began to lag behind lived reality. The rules still existed, but the circumstances they were designed for were slowly shifting. Correspondence, too, became an increasingly complex space. Letters had always carried weight in Edwardian society. They were records of tone, intention, and relationship. But as communication expanded in both volume and speed, maintaining the exacting standards of form became more demanding. A letter had to be composed with care, its language measured, its structure appropriate. Yet the number of letters a woman might receive and send could grow significantly, especially if her social and intellectual circles were widening. The result was not an immediate breakdown of etiquette, but a quiet stretching of it. Some women adhered strictly to traditional forms, maintaining the full ritual of polite correspondence. Others began to adapt, allowing for slightly more direct phrasing, slightly quicker exchanges, a slightly more flexible tone. These changes were often subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they hinted at a broader shift in how communication itself was being understood. This same pattern appeared in public visibility. Earlier expectations had emphasized controlled presence, being seen, but in a carefully managed way. However, as women became more active in public life, whether through reform movements, education, or cultural participation, the very idea of being seen began to change. Visibility was no longer always something to be softened or moderated. In some contexts, it became necessary. And yet, the etiquette surrounding visibility did not immediately adjust to this new reality. A woman might be expected to speak publicly, to engage with audiences, to participate in discussions, while still maintaining the same standards of composure and restraint that had been designed for more private, controlled settings. The result was a kind of dual expectation. She had to be present, but not too assertive. Clear, but not forceful. Engaged, but not dominating. This balancing act could be particularly evident in mixed social environments, where traditional expectations and newer roles intersected. A gathering might include individuals who held firmly to older codes, alongside those who were more open to evolving norms. In such settings, a woman's behavior could be interpreted in multiple ways at once. What seemed appropriately confident to one observer might appear overly forward to another. What seemed refreshingly direct to one might seem lacking in refinement to someone else. This ambiguity did not remove the need for etiquette. If anything, it made it more complex. The rules were no longer entirely stable, but they were still active. Women had to read not only the situation, but the expectations of those present, adjusting their behavior in real time to navigate these overlapping frameworks. Dress continued to play a role in this navigation, but even here, small shifts were beginning to appear. While the overall expectation of controlled, elegant presentation remained, there was increasing room for variation, for subtle personal expression within the bounds of propriety. Fabrics, colors, and cuts could reflect changing tastes, and with them, changing ideas about identity and presence. But the underlying principle remained intact. Appearance communicated. A woman's clothing still signaled her awareness of context, her respect for occasion, her understanding of social cues. The difference was that these signals were no longer entirely fixed. They could be interpreted in slightly different ways, depending on who was looking and what they expected to see. In this environment, mistakes became more difficult to define. In a strictly regulated system, a breach of etiquette is often clear. In a shifting system, it becomes more ambiguous. Was a particular action inappropriate or simply unconventional? Was a deviation from form a sign of carelessness or of modernity? These questions did not always have immediate answers, and the uncertainty itself became part of the social experience. At the same time, certain areas of etiquette remained remarkably resilient. Formal occasions, for example, often preserved older standards more firmly than everyday interactions. At a well-structured dinner, a formal reception, or a significant social event, the expectations could still be quite precise. In these settings, the familiar patterns reasserted themselves, providing a sense of continuity even as the wider social landscape shifted. This coexistence of stability and change is one of the defining features of Edwardian etiquette. It was not simply a system in decline, nor was it entirely rigid. It was adapting unevenly, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes almost invisibly. And within that adaptation, the role of women remained central, because it was through their conduct that many of these changes were most clearly expressed. What makes this particularly striking is how much of this process occurred without formal acknowledgement. There was no single moment when the rules were rewritten. Instead, they were adjusted in practice through countless small decisions. How to phrase a letter, how to respond to an invitation, how to present oneself in a new kind of setting. Each decision might seem minor, but together they gradually reshaped the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. And as these boundaries shifted, they exposed something that had always been present but not always visible: the extent to which etiquette depended not just on fixed rules, but on shared understanding. When that shared understanding began to fragment, even slightly, the system had to rely more heavily on interpretation, on judgment, on the ability to read subtle cues. It is in this reliance on interpretation that the next layer of Edwardian etiquette becomes particularly revealing. Because when rules are no longer entirely explicit, they begin to operate through implication, through suggestion, through the quiet negotiation of meaning between individuals who may not always agree on what those meanings should be. And once etiquette begins to operate through implication rather than certainty, it shifts from being a fixed system into something closer to a language, one that has to be read carefully, interpreted in context, and spoken with a degree of precision that is not always visible from the outside. In Edwardian society, this unspoken language became especially important in situations where direct expression would have been considered improper. Refusals, for example, were rarely delivered in blunt terms. A woman was not expected to say no in a way that created discomfort or confrontation. Instead, refusal often took the form of delay, of gentle deflection, of carefully chosen phrasing that allowed the other person to understand the outcome without being openly denied. This required both parties to participate in the same interpretive system. One had to recognize the signal, and the other had to deliver it without overstatement. This indirectness was not simply a matter of politeness. It was a way of preserving social harmony in a world where relationships were tightly observed and often interconnected. A direct refusal could create tension that extended beyond the immediate moment. A softened refusal allowed both sides to maintain dignity, even if the outcome was the same. But it also meant that communication could become layered, sometimes even opaque, requiring attention to tone, timing, and context that went far beyond the words themselves. Invitations followed a similar pattern. Accepting or declining was not only about availability, but about maintaining the correct balance of enthusiasm and restraint. To accept too quickly might suggest eagerness. To hesitate too long might imply reluctance. Even the wording of a response carried meaning. A phrase that seemed perfectly polite on the surface could, within this system, signal distance, warmth, obligation, or genuine pleasure. This subtle calibration extended into the management of social obligations. A visit returned too quickly might feel excessive, while one returned too slowly could be interpreted as neglect. Gifts required acknowledgement, but not in a way that created imbalance. Gratitude had to be expressed, but with a measured tone that avoided both coldness and exaggeration. Each of these interactions formed part of an ongoing exchange, a kind of social accounting that was rarely spoken of directly but widely understood. At the center of all this was the idea of emotional control, not the absence of feeling, but the careful presentation of it. Edwardian etiquette did not require women to be unfeeling. It required them to manage how feeling appeared in public. Joy, disappointment, irritation, affection. All of these had acceptable forms of expression. To exceed those forms was to risk appearing unbalanced, overly familiar, or lacking in refinement. And yet, as with so many aspects of this system, there was a quiet contradiction. The more refined the expression, the more effort it often required behind the scenes. A perfectly composed response might mask uncertainty. A graceful interaction might conceal careful calculation. This does not make the behavior insincere, but it does remind us that sincerity and expression were not always aligned in the way modern audiences might expect. The importance of this emotional presentation became particularly evident in situations involving conflict or discomfort. Disagreements were not meant to unfold openly in polite society. Instead, they were managed through avoidance, redirection, or subtle signaling. A change of topic, a shift in tone, a slight withdrawal from conversation. These could all indicate that a boundary had been reached. The goal was not to resolve conflict in the moment, but to prevent it from becoming visible. This approach had its advantages. It allowed diverse individuals to share space without constant friction. It maintained a surface of calm that could be genuinely comforting in a world that was otherwise experiencing rapid change. But it also had limitations. Issues that were not addressed directly could persist beneath the surface, creating a different kind of tension, one that was less visible but no less real. For women navigating this environment, the ability to read and respond to these subtle cues became a form of social intelligence. It required attention, memory, and a sensitivity to nuance that could be quite demanding. A misreading of tone, a missed implication, or an overly direct response could disrupt the balance that etiquette sought to maintain. And as the range of social situations expanded, so did the complexity of this interpretive work. A woman might move between different circles, family, friends, formal society, emerging professional environments, each with its own expectations and variations in tone. The language of etiquette was not entirely uniform across these spaces. What was appropriate in one setting might feel out of place in another. This variation made adaptability increasingly important. A woman could no longer rely solely on a fixed set of rules. She had to adjust, sometimes subtly, sometimes more noticeably, to the expectations of the moment. This did not mean abandoning etiquette, but rather applying it with a degree of flexibility that earlier generations might not have required. It is in this flexibility that we begin to see the early outlines of change, not just in behavior, but in underlying assumptions. If rules can be adjusted even slightly, then they are not entirely absolute. If interpretation plays a larger role, then authority becomes less centralized. And if individuals must navigate these choices themselves, then personal judgment begins to carry more weight. At the same time, the social consequences of misjudgment remain significant. Reputation, once shaped, was not easily altered. A pattern of behavior, even if based on misunderstanding, could influence how a woman was perceived for years. This is why caution remained such a consistent theme. Even as the system became more flexible, it did not become more forgiving. And so the language of etiquette continued to evolve, not by replacing old rules with new ones, but by layering interpretation over established forms. The visible structure remained, but beneath it, a more dynamic process was taking place, one that depended on reading, adjusting, and responding in ways that were not always explicitly defined. This layered complexity becomes even more apparent when we look at moments where expectation and reality came into direct contact, when a rule could be followed perfectly and still produce an unexpected result, or when a small deviation revealed more about the system than strict adherence ever could. And it is often in those small deviations, those moments where a rule is followed perfectly yet something still feels slightly off, that the deeper purpose of Edwardian etiquette begins to show itself more clearly, because etiquette was never designed to guarantee comfort. It was designed to maintain order. And sometimes, maintaining order meant allowing a situation to remain slightly strained rather than allowing it to become openly disruptive. Consider, for example, the quiet complexity of seating arrangements at formal gatherings. On the surface, these arrangements appeared orderly, even elegant. Guests were placed with apparent care, balancing conversation, status, and compatibility. But beneath that careful placement was often a more strategic intention. Certain individuals might be kept apart. Others might be placed together to encourage a connection. A woman might find herself seated beside someone she did not know well, or perhaps someone she would not naturally choose to speak with, and yet the expectation remained that she would manage the interaction with ease. Here, etiquette provided the structure but not necessarily the comfort. It ensured that conversation would occur, that the evening would proceed smoothly, but it did not remove the underlying reality that these interactions were sometimes orchestrated for reasons beyond simple enjoyment. A woman might be expected to sustain polite conversation for an extended period, drawing on the familiar strategies of neutral topics, gentle curiosity, and restrained expression, even when the interaction itself required effort. This reveals another layer of the system. Etiquette did not always align with personal preference. It often required individuals, and particularly women, to prioritize the overall harmony of the setting over their own immediate comfort. And in doing so, it turned social life into a kind of shared performance, where each participant contributed to maintaining the desired atmosphere. The same dynamic could be seen in the management of awkward encounters. When an unexpected situation arose, a misplaced remark, an unintended slight, a moment of visible discomfort, the response was rarely direct correction. Instead, the situation was softened, redirected, or quietly absorbed. A change in topic might ease tension. A slight adjustment in tone might signal understanding. A moment of silence might allow the interaction to reset without drawing attention to the disruption. This approach required a high level of awareness, but it also depended on a shared commitment to preserving the surface of calm. Everyone involved had to recognize the signal and respond accordingly. If one person failed to do so, the balance could be disturbed, and the awkwardness might become more pronounced. In this way, etiquette functioned not only as a set of rules, but as a cooperative system. Its success depended on collective participation. Each individual's behavior influenced the overall atmosphere, and maintaining that atmosphere required a kind of quiet coordination that was rarely acknowledged explicitly. For women, this coordination often extended into situations where the expectations themselves were not entirely fair. A man might speak too freely, or behave with a degree of informality that would not be acceptable for a woman, and yet the responsibility for smoothing the interaction could still fall on her. She might be expected to respond with grace, to redirect the conversation, to maintain the tone, even when the imbalance was clear. This imbalance was not always openly discussed, but it was widely understood. It formed part of the unspoken knowledge that guided behavior, and it contributed to the sense that etiquette, while presented as a universal system, often operated differently depending on who was being observed and judged. There were also moments when adherence to etiquette could produce outcomes that seemed, from a modern perspective, almost paradoxical. A woman might follow every rule precisely, her timing, her tone, her appearance, her conduct all perfectly aligned with expectation, and yet still find herself misinterpreted. Perhaps her restraint was read as distance. Perhaps her politeness was seen as lack of interest. Perhaps her careful neutrality left others uncertain of her intentions. These situations highlight the limits of even the most carefully constructed system. Etiquette could guide behavior, but it could not fully control interpretation. Meaning was always shaped by those who observed as well as those who acted. And in a social environment where observation was constant, interpretation could vary in subtle but significant ways. This uncertainty added another layer to the experience of navigating Edwardian society. It was not enough to follow the rules. One had to anticipate how those rules would be read, and by whom. A gesture that seemed entirely appropriate in one circle might carry a different implication in another. A tone that felt balanced to one listener might seem too reserved or too expressive to someone else. And so, beneath the visible structure of etiquette, there existed a more fluid, more dynamic process of adjustment and interpretation. Women learned not only what to do, but how their actions might be perceived across different contexts. This required a kind of social awareness that extended beyond simple rule-following into a continuous, often quiet process of calibration. At the same time, there were limits to how much adjustment was possible. Certain boundaries remained firm, particularly in relation to reputation and propriety. A woman could adapt her behavior within those boundaries, but stepping beyond them carried risks that were not easily reversed. This is why, even as the system showed signs of flexibility, it retained a core of rigidity that shaped the outer edges of acceptable conduct. It is within this balance between flexibility and constraint, between intention and interpretation, that the lived reality of Edwardian etiquette becomes most visible. It was not a static code, nor was it entirely fluid. It was a system in motion, responding to subtle pressures while maintaining a recognizable form. And as that motion continued, it began to intersect more directly with broader changes in society. Changes that would place increasing strain on the very assumptions that etiquette had been designed to support. Because the more the world required women to act, to speak, to participate in ways that extended beyond traditional boundaries, the more difficult it became to maintain a system that had been built around controlled visibility and carefully limited expression. It is at this point that some of the most revealing tensions begin to surface, not in grand public moments, but in the quiet, everyday situations where expectation and reality meet, and where the rules, however carefully followed, start to reveal the limits of what they can contain. And it is in those quiet, everyday situations, where expectation and reality met without ceremony, that the limits of the system became most visible, not through open defiance, but through small, almost imperceptible adjustments. Take, for instance, the simple act of conversation when it drifted beyond safe territory. Edwardian etiquette encouraged agreeable exchange, but the world itself was becoming less agreeable in its topics. Questions of politics, reform, education, labor, and social change were increasingly difficult to avoid. A woman might find herself in a room where such matters hovered just beneath the surface, present enough to be felt, but not always considered appropriate to discuss directly. In these moments, etiquette did not provide a clear answer. It offered strategies, deflection, softening, redirection, but it could not fully resolve the underlying tension. If a subject was raised, a woman had to decide whether to engage, and if so, how far. Too much restraint might seem evasive. Too much openness might seem improper. The correct path was not fixed. It had to be judged, often in the moment, with only the faintest guidance from established norms. This kind of judgment became more important as social gatherings themselves began to shift. The traditional drawing room, with its predictable rhythms and familiar participants, was no longer the only setting in which women appeared. Lectures, exhibitions, charitable meetings, and public events created new kinds of social spaces, spaces where the boundaries between formal and informal behavior were less clearly defined. In a lecture hall, for example, the expectations of silence and attentiveness might resemble those of a formal visit, but the purpose of the gathering was different. A woman was there not simply to be seen, but to listen, to learn, perhaps even to form opinions. And yet, the etiquette governing her behavior had not been entirely rewritten to reflect this new role. She was still expected to maintain composure, to avoid drawing undue attention, to present herself with the same controlled elegance that defined more traditional settings. This blending of roles could produce subtle but persistent uncertainty. Was it appropriate to ask a question? If so, how directly? Was it acceptable to express disagreement? Could one engage in extended conversation with unfamiliar individuals in such a setting? Or would that risk appearing overly forward? These were not questions with uniform answers, and so each woman had to navigate them with care, drawing on both inherited rules and personal judgment. The same uncertainty appeared in the realm of friendships, particularly those that crossed traditional boundaries. As women's circles expanded, they encountered individuals from different backgrounds, with different expectations and levels of familiarity with established etiquette. A friendship that felt natural and genuine might not fit neatly within the older framework of visiting cards, formal calls, and carefully managed introductions. In such cases, etiquette could begin to feel both too rigid and too vague at the same time. Too rigid because it imposed forms that did not always match the reality of the relationship. Too vague because it offered little guidance for situations that had not been fully anticipated. The result was a gradual reshaping of social interaction, not through formal change, but through lived experience. This reshaping was often most visible in the small decisions that accumulated over time. A woman might choose to write a slightly more direct letter to a friend, setting aside some of the formal phrasing that would have been expected in an earlier generation. She might allow a conversation to continue a little longer than strict etiquette would suggest, prioritizing connection over form. She might attend an event without the full structure of introductions that would once have been considered essential. Each of these choices was minor in isolation, but together they began to alter the texture of social life. The rules did not disappear, but they became more flexible, more open to interpretation. And as they did, the authority of those rules shifted slightly, from an external standard to something more internal, something that relied on individual judgment as much as collective expectation. At the same time, there remained a strong incentive to maintain the appearance of adherence. Even as behavior evolved, the outward forms of etiquette often persisted. A woman might adapt her conduct in subtle ways, but she would still present herself as properly mannered, properly composed, properly aligned with social expectations. The change was not announced. It was absorbed. This quiet adaptation created an interesting duality. On the surface, Edwardian society could still appear highly structured, even rigid. The rituals were still performed. The language of etiquette was still spoken. But beneath that surface, there was a growing flexibility, a willingness to adjust, to interpret, to respond to new circumstances in ways that were not always explicitly defined. It is in this duality that the system's resilience becomes clear. Etiquette did not collapse under pressure. It adjusted, sometimes almost invisibly, allowing individuals to navigate new realities without entirely abandoning the familiar forms that gave social life its coherence. And yet, this resilience had its limits. The more the world changed, the more those limits were tested. There were situations in which no amount of careful phrasing, no degree of composure, could fully reconcile expectation with reality. Moments when the rules themselves began to feel inadequate, not because they were poorly designed, but because they had been created for a different kind of world. These moments did not always lead to open conflict or dramatic change. More often, they produced a quiet awareness, a sense that something was shifting, even if the full shape of that shift was not yet clear. Women navigating these situations might not have articulated it in explicit terms, but they would have felt it in the small hesitations, the slight adjustments, the decisions that required more thought than they once did. And as that awareness spread, it began to influence not just individual behavior, but the collective understanding of what etiquette itself was meant to achieve. Was it a fixed code to be preserved, or a flexible system to be adapted? Was it a reflection of enduring values, or a response to specific historical conditions? These questions did not always have immediate answers, but they lingered beneath the surface, shaping the way rules were followed, interpreted, and occasionally, quietly set aside. It is from within this atmosphere of subtle questioning that the next layer of Edwardian etiquette begins to emerge, one that is less about the visible performance of manners and more about the internal negotiation of identity, where the expectations placed on women were not only external guidelines, but part of an ongoing process of deciding who they were allowed to become. And once etiquette begins to shape not only behavior but identity, the rules take on a different weight, because they are no longer simply about what a woman does, but about what she is understood to be. In Edwardian society, this connection between conduct and identity was particularly strong. A woman was not judged only by individual actions, but by the consistency of those actions over time. Etiquette became a kind of quiet narrative, a story told through repeated gestures, tones, and choices. To behave correctly once was not enough. One had to behave correctly always, or at least with enough consistency that any deviation could be dismissed as accidental rather than revealing. This expectation created a sense of continuity in how women presented themselves, but it also narrowed the space for experimentation. A new way of speaking, a different tone in conversation, a more direct form of expression. These could not be tested casually. Each carried the risk of being interpreted not as a momentary variation, but as a sign of deeper character. In this way, etiquette did not simply guide behavior. It stabilized identity, sometimes at the cost of flexibility. And yet, as the earlier tensions suggest, that stability was becoming more difficult to maintain without adjustment. The world in which Edwardian women lived was not entirely aligned with the assumptions that underpinned their social training. Education was expanding, and with it, exposure to new ideas. Public discourse was becoming more visible. Opportunities, though still limited, were widening in certain areas. Each of these developments introduced new dimensions to a woman's sense of self, dimensions that etiquette had not been fully designed to accommodate. This is where the internal negotiation becomes most visible. A woman might understand quite clearly how she was expected to behave in a formal drawing room, and yet feel equally aware that her interests, her knowledge, or her ambitions extended beyond that space. The question was not simply how to behave, but how to integrate these different aspects of self within a system that preferred clarity and consistency. One way this negotiation appeared was in the management of opinion. Edwardian etiquette did not forbid women from having views, but it shaped how those views could be expressed. Strong opinions, particularly on controversial subjects, had to be presented with care. A woman might frame her thoughts as observations rather than assertions, as questions rather than declarations. She might allow others to speak first, aligning or gently diverging from their positions in a way that maintained harmony. This approach required a kind of intellectual restraint that could be both skillful and limiting. It allowed participation without disruption, but it also constrained the form that participation could take. A woman who wished to speak more directly had to decide whether the value of that directness outweighed the potential cost to her social standing. And because that cost was not always immediate or visible, the decision was rarely simple. The same pattern can be seen in the realm of ambition, though it was often expressed more indirectly. Ambition, in the modern sense, was not a quality that Edwardian etiquette openly encouraged in women, particularly within traditional social circles. Yet ambition did not disappear simply because it was not named. It found expression in other forms, in the careful management of a household, in the cultivation of social networks, in involvement with charitable or cultural organizations, in the pursuit of education. These activities could be framed as extensions of accepted roles, allowing women to expand their influence without appearing to challenge established norms. But the boundary between acceptable extension and perceived overreach was not always clear. A woman who became too visible, too active, or too independent in her pursuits might find that the same qualities that earned admiration in one context invited criticism in another. This ambiguity required a constant awareness of scale and presentation. It was not only what one did, but how prominently one did it, how it was framed, and how it fit within the expectations of the surrounding community. A well-managed project could be seen as admirable. The same project, if pursued with too much visibility or assertiveness, might be viewed differently. Even leisure, which might seem free from such constraints, was shaped by this interplay between identity and etiquette. Activities were not chosen purely for personal enjoyment, but also for how they reflected on the individual. Reading, attending cultural events, participating in certain forms of recreation, all carried associations that contributed to a woman's overall image. Leisure became another space in which identity was expressed, but within boundaries that remained quietly present. And yet, despite these constraints, there was a growing sense that identity could not be entirely contained within the existing framework. The more women engaged with new ideas and new experiences, the more difficult it became to present a single, unchanging version of self. Small variations began to appear, slight shifts in tone, in interest, in behavior, that suggested a more complex internal landscape than etiquette alone could fully describe. These variations did not always lead to visible change, but they accumulated over time, creating a subtle pressure within the system. Etiquette continued to provide the language of social interaction, but the meanings conveyed through that language were becoming more layered. A familiar gesture might carry a slightly different intention. A conventional phrase might be used with a nuance that earlier generations would not have recognized. This layering of meaning is one of the more intriguing aspects of Edwardian etiquette, because it shows how a system can remain outwardly stable while undergoing gradual internal transformation. The rules are still followed, but they are interpreted in ways that reflect new realities, new priorities, and new understandings of self. At the same time, the risk of misinterpretation remained ever present. When meaning becomes more layered, it also becomes more fragile. A gesture intended as thoughtful might be read as distant. A carefully moderated opinion might be seen as evasive. The very strategies that allowed women to navigate complex expectations could also create new forms of ambiguity. And so the process of internal negotiation continued, shaped by both opportunity and constraint. Women moved through their social worlds with a heightened awareness of how they were perceived, but also with a growing sense of their own interior complexity. The balance between these two forces, external expectation and internal identity, became one of the defining experiences of Edwardian womanhood. It is within this balance that we begin to see how etiquette, far from being a simple set of rules, functioned as a kind of framework for navigating change. It provided continuity, even as the meanings attached to it evolved. It offered stability, even as the conditions it was designed for began to shift. And as those conditions continued to shift, the question of how much could be contained within that framework became increasingly difficult to ignore, especially in those moments when private understanding and public expectation no longer aligned as neatly as they once had. And it was precisely in those moments, when private understanding and public expectation no longer aligned as neatly as they once had, that etiquette revealed one of its most subtle and perhaps most demanding functions. Because when alignment breaks down, A system like this does not immediately collapse. Instead, it asks more of the individual. A woman might find herself in a situation where she understood something internally, an opinion, a preference, a sense of disagreement that could not be expressed directly without consequence. The question then was not simply whether to follow the rule, but how to follow it in a way that preserved both outward correctness and inward coherence. This required a kind of careful partitioning. One learned to separate what could be shown from what had to remain unspoken, and to do so without allowing that separation to become visible. This is where etiquette becomes less about performance alone and more about control of perception. The external behavior remains smooth, continuous, and consistent, but beneath it, a more complex process is taking place. Decisions are being made quietly in real time about how much to reveal, how much to soften, how much to redirect. The rules still guide the outer shape of behavior, but the inner content is being managed with increasing precision. This internal management becomes especially evident in moments of sustained interaction, long conversations, extended visits, shared activities, where the effort required to maintain alignment can accumulate over time. A brief exchange can be carefully controlled with relative ease, but an entire afternoon, an evening, or a sequence of engagements demands endurance. It requires the ability to remain attentive, composed, and responsive without allowing fatigue or distraction to disrupt the carefully maintained surface. And yet, even within this discipline, there were small spaces of relief, moments where the strictness of etiquette softened slightly, not through formal permission, but through mutual understanding. Among close friends, for example, the tone might shift. Conversation could become more relaxed, less constrained by the need for constant calibration. But even here, the boundaries were not entirely removed. The habits of restraint, once learned, did not simply disappear. They lingered, shaping even the most informal interactions in subtle ways. This persistence of habit is one of the reasons Edwardian etiquette could feel so pervasive. It was not limited to specific occasions. It extended into the fabric of daily life, influencing how women spoke, moved, and even thought about their own behavior. The distinction between formal and informal settings existed, but it was not absolute. The same principles, control, awareness, restraint, carried across contexts, though sometimes in softened forms. At the same time, there were environments in which these principles were more difficult to sustain. Situations that demanded quicker responses, more direct communication, or greater emotional engagement could place strain on the established patterns. A sudden change in circumstance, an unexpected encounter, a moment of urgency, these could disrupt the careful pacing that etiquette relied upon. In such moments, the underlying priorities of the system became clearer. When there was no time to consider every nuance, the core expectation remained: maintain composure. Even if the precise rule could not be followed, the broader principle of control was expected to hold. A woman who could navigate an unexpected situation with calm, measured behavior would still be seen as aligned with the spirit of etiquette, even if the letter of the rules had been set aside. This emphasis on composure over exact form suggests something important about the nature of the system. The rules themselves were not entirely rigid. They could be bent, adjusted, or even temporarily set aside when necessary. But the underlying values, restraint, awareness, control of expression, remained constant. These values formed the deeper structure that etiquette sought to preserve. And as long as those values were maintained, a certain degree of flexibility was possible. A woman might adapt her behavior to suit a new situation, but she would do so in a way that still reflected the expected tone. The outward form might change slightly, but the internal discipline would remain visible. However, this flexibility was not evenly distributed. Some women had more room to adapt than others, depending on their position, their reputation, and the circles in which they moved. Those with established standing might be granted a degree of latitude. A slight deviation from form could be interpreted as individuality rather than error. For others, particularly those still establishing their place, the margin for variation was narrower. This difference in latitude adds another layer to the experience of navigating Edwardian etiquette. It was not only about knowing the rules, but about understanding how strictly they would be applied in one's particular context. The same action could be interpreted differently depending on who performed it and under what circumstances. This awareness required a kind of strategic thinking that went beyond simple conformity. A woman had to assess not only the situation, but her own position within it. She had to consider how her actions would be read, what assumptions might be attached to them, and how they would contribute to the ongoing narrative of her identity. And yet, even with this careful assessment, uncertainty remained. The social environment was too complex, too dynamic, for any set of rules to guarantee a particular outcome. Interpretation once again played a central role. Others would read her behavior through their own expectations, their own experiences, their own biases. This means that etiquette, for all its structure, could never fully control meaning. It could guide, suggest, and shape, but it could not eliminate ambiguity. And in that ambiguity, there was both risk and possibility. Risk because misinterpretation could affect reputation. Possibility because meaning could be shaped in subtle ways, allowing for a degree of expression within the constraints of the system. It is within this interplay of control and ambiguity that the next phase of Edwardian etiquette begins to take form, one in which the rules are still present, still influential, but increasingly intertwined with a more personal, more reflective understanding of behavior. Because once individuals begin to recognize that the system depends on interpretation as much as instruction, they also begin to see that their own choices, however small, contribute to how that system functions. And in that recognition, the boundary between following etiquette and shaping it becomes less distinct, opening a quiet but significant space for change that continues to unfold just beneath the surface of everyday social life. And it is within that quiet space, where following etiquette and shaping it begin to blur, that the system starts to reveal something even more subtle. It was never entirely fixed to begin with. What appeared, from the outside, as a stable set of rules had always depended on repetition and agreement. The more consistently a behavior was practiced, the more natural it seemed, and the more unquestionable it appeared. But once small variations began to enter that repetition, even gently, they introduced the possibility that the rules themselves were not permanent, but maintained. This becomes especially visible when we look at generational differences. Younger women entering society did not always absorb etiquette in exactly the same way as those who had come before them. They learned the same forms, the same gestures, the same expectations, but they encountered them in a slightly different world. Their education might include broader subjects. Their social environments might be more varied. Their exposure to new ideas, even indirectly, might influence how they understood the purpose behind the rules they were taught. As a result, they might follow those rules with a slightly different emphasis. A gesture that had once been purely formal might carry a touch more personal intention. A conversation that would previously have remained entirely neutral might include a hint of individual perspective. These changes were often small enough to pass unnoticed in isolation, but over time, they accumulated, creating a subtle shift in tone. Older generations, observing these shifts, did not always interpret them as change. Sometimes they were seen simply as variation, or as minor lapses in discipline. At other times, they were accepted as natural adaptations to new circumstances. And occasionally, they were resisted, with renewed emphasis placed on preserving established forms. This interplay between acceptance and resistance contributed to the gradual, uneven evolution of etiquette across the Edwardian period. It is important to notice how rarely this evolution was discussed openly. There was no widespread acknowledgement that the rules were changing. Instead, change occurred through practice, through countless small decisions made in real situations. A woman might choose a slightly different phrasing, a slightly more direct tone, a slightly less formal approach, and if that choice did not produce negative consequences, it might be repeated. If others adopted similar variations, the new form would begin to feel familiar. This process required a kind of collective sensitivity. Individuals had to observe not only their own behavior, but the responses it generated. A deviation that was accepted might signal that the boundaries had shifted slightly. A deviation that was met with discomfort might suggest that the older rule still held. In this way, etiquette functioned as a feedback system, continuously adjusting to the responses of those who participated in it. At the same time, the presence of written guides and manuals on etiquette continued to reinforce the idea of stability. These texts presented the rules as established, coherent, and authoritative. They offered clarity in a world that could otherwise feel uncertain. But even these guides could not fully capture the lived reality of social interaction, which was always more fluid, more responsive to context than any written description could convey. This gap between written rule and lived practice is another place where the system's flexibility becomes apparent. A woman might know the prescribed form for a particular situation, but she would also know from experience how that form was actually applied in her social circle. The difference between the two could be subtle, but it was significant. It allowed for adaptation without requiring explicit revision of the rules themselves. And yet, this adaptability did not eliminate the sense of pressure. If anything, it could increase it. When rules are clear and fixed, they can be followed with confidence. When they are open to interpretation, each decision carries more weight. A woman must not only know the rule, but judge how it should be applied in that specific moment. This judgment becomes part of her social skill, but it also demands attention and care. This demand is particularly evident in moments where expectations conflict. A situation might call for both formality and warmth, both restraint and engagement, both adherence to tradition and responsiveness to new circumstances. Balancing these competing expectations required a level of awareness that went beyond simple rule following. In these moments, the idea of correctness becomes more nuanced. It is no longer a matter of matching behavior to a fixed standard, but of achieving a kind of balance that feels appropriate to the situation. This balance is not always easy to define, but it is often recognizable when it is achieved. It appears as ease, as naturalness, as a sense that everything is proceeding as it should, even if the exact rules being followed are not entirely clear. This sense of ease, however, can be misleading. It is often the result of considerable effort, both individual and collective. Each participant contributes to maintaining the flow of interaction, adjusting their behavior in response to others, smoothing over potential disruptions, and reinforcing the shared understanding of what is appropriate. And it is here that the system reveals one of its most enduring characteristics: its reliance on cooperation. Etiquette is not enforced solely through external authority. It is sustained through mutual recognition. Each person agrees implicitly to participate in the maintenance of the social environment. This agreement is not always conscious, but it is powerful. For women in Edwardian society, this cooperative aspect could be both supportive and demanding. It created a shared framework that made interaction more predictable, but it also required constant participation. One could not simply step outside the system without consequences. Even small departures had to be managed carefully, framed in ways that preserved the overall sense of order. At the same time, the very act of managing these departures contributed to the system's gradual transformation. Each adjustment, each reinterpretation, each small shift in emphasis added to the evolving understanding of what etiquette could accommodate. And as this evolution continued, it began to intersect more directly with larger social changes that were becoming increasingly difficult to contain within the existing framework. Because while etiquette could adapt to small variations, it was less equipped to absorb changes that altered the fundamental assumptions about women's roles, visibility, and voice. It is at this intersection between a system designed for stability and a society moving toward change that the next phase of Edwardian etiquette becomes particularly revealing, as the quiet adjustments of everyday behavior begin to meet pressures that cannot be resolved through subtle variation alone. And it is precisely at that point, where subtle variation is no longer enough, that the system begins to show where its edges truly are. Because etiquette could absorb small shifts in tone, timing, and expression, but it struggled when the underlying purpose of those rules started to change. The original logic of Edwardian etiquette rested on a particular vision of social order: clearly defined roles, controlled visibility, and a careful separation between public and private life. As long as those assumptions held, the rules could be adjusted without losing their meaning. But when those assumptions themselves began to shift, the adjustments became more difficult to sustain. One of the most telling examples of this tension can be seen in the increasing presence of women in structured public roles. Whether through organized charitable work, education, or emerging forms of civic participation, women were now expected to appear in settings that demanded more than quiet composure. They were expected to engage, to contribute, and at times to lead. Yet the etiquette that governed their behavior had been designed for a different kind of presence, one that emphasized moderation, deference, and controlled interaction. The result was a subtle but persistent mismatch. A woman might be asked to speak at a gathering, to organize an event, or to coordinate a project, and in doing so, she would need to adopt a more direct and active form of communication. But at the same time, she was still expected to maintain the outward signs of restraint that defined proper conduct. This created a kind of layered performance. On one level, she fulfilled the practical demands of the role, giving instructions, expressing ideas, making decisions. On another, she carefully shaped how those actions appeared, softening directness, moderating tone, and ensuring that authority did not become too visible. Leadership, in this context, had to be exercised in a way that did not disrupt the expectations of femininity that etiquette sought to preserve. The effort required to maintain this balance could be considerable. It was not simply a matter of learning new behaviors, but of integrating them with existing ones in a way that felt coherent. A woman might move from a setting where she was expected to listen quietly to one where she was expected to contribute actively, and then back again, all within the same day. Each transition required adjustment, a recalibration of tone, posture, and expression, and these transitions were not always seamless. There were moments when the boundaries between roles blurred, when the habits of one setting carried into another in ways that felt slightly out of place. A tone that was appropriate in a public discussion might seem too direct in a private gathering. A measured restraint that worked well in a formal visit might appear overly distant in a collaborative setting. Navigating these shifts required a heightened sensitivity to context, and even then, misalignment was possible. At the same time, the visibility of these new roles made the question of perception even more significant. When a woman acted in a more public or active capacity, her behavior was often observed more closely, not less. The same qualities that enabled her to fulfill her responsibilities, clarity, confidence, initiative, could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the expectations of the observer. For some, these qualities might signal competence and capability. For others, they might seem to challenge established norms of conduct. The interpretation was not fixed, and this variability added another layer of complexity to the already intricate system of etiquette. It is here that the idea of appropriateness begins to shift in a noticeable way. Previously, appropriateness had been closely tied to adherence to established forms. Now, it increasingly depended on the successful negotiation of competing expectations. A behavior might be considered appropriate not because it followed a specific rule, but because it achieved a balance between different, sometimes conflicting, demands. This shift did not eliminate the importance of etiquette. If anything, it made it more nuanced. The rules still provided a framework, but they were no longer sufficient on their own. They had to be interpreted in light of changing circumstances, and that interpretation required judgment, awareness, and adaptability. At the same time, there remained a strong desire in many circles to preserve the appearance of continuity. The rituals, the language, the outward forms of etiquette continued to be practiced, even as their application evolved. This continuity offered a sense of stability, a way of maintaining connection to a familiar social order in a period that was otherwise marked by gradual but significant change. This dual movement adaptation beneath the surface, continuity in outward form, allowed the system to persist longer than it might otherwise have done. It gave the impression that little had changed, even as the lived experience of those within the system was becoming more complex. And yet, this balance was not entirely stable. The more demands placed on women to act beyond traditional boundaries, the more difficult it became to reconcile those demands with a system built on controlled expression. The adjustments that had once seemed sufficient began to feel strained, as though they were stretching the framework beyond its intended limits. These strains were not always dramatic. They often appeared as small inconsistencies, moments where behavior did not quite align with expectation, or where the effort required to maintain that alignment became more visible. A slightly sharper tone, a more direct response, a visible hesitation. These could all signal that the balance was becoming harder to sustain. Over time, these small signals accumulated, contributing to a broader sense that the system, while still functioning, was no longer entirely at ease with itself. The rules were still there, still influential, but they were operating in a context that was no longer fully aligned with their original assumptions. And it is from within this growing misalignment that the next stage of change begins to emerge, not through sudden rejection or dramatic transformation, but through a gradual recognition that the framework itself might need to be reconsidered, as the roles, expectations, and identities it was designed to support continue to evolve in ways that can no longer be fully contained by subtle adjustment alone. And once that quiet recognition begins to take hold, that the framework itself may no longer fully fit the lives it is meant to shape, the role of etiquette starts to shift in a way that is less visible but more consequential. Because at that point, the question is no longer simply how to follow the rules, or even how to adapt them. It becomes a question of when they apply and when they do not. In earlier phases of Edwardian society, the reach of etiquette had been broad and relatively consistent. It governed the drawing room, the dining table, the street, the written word, and the smallest gestures of daily interaction. Its authority rested on the assumption that social life itself was unified, that the same principles could be carried from one context to another with only minor adjustments. But as the world around it became more varied, that unity began to loosen. New environments brought with them new expectations, and not all of those expectations could be comfortably absorbed into the existing system. A charitable meeting, for example, might prioritize efficiency and coordination over the slow, measured rhythms of formal visiting. A discussion of social reform might require clarity and directness that sat uneasily alongside the traditional preference for softened expression. In these situations, women began to encounter a subtle but important distinction: the difference between social correctness and functional effectiveness. Etiquette still offered guidance on how to behave properly, but that guidance did not always align with what the situation required in order to move forward. This did not immediately lead to rejection of the rules. Instead, it introduced a kind of selective application. A woman might adhere closely to traditional etiquette in one setting, while allowing herself more flexibility in another. She might maintain the full formality of correspondence in social matters, while adopting a more direct tone in practical or organizational contexts. These choices were not always articulated, even internally. They were often made instinctively, based on a growing sense of what each situation demanded. But the effect was significant. It meant that etiquette was no longer a single, continuous framework applied across all aspects of life. It became, instead, a set of tools that could be used differently depending on context. This shift toward selective application required a different kind of awareness. It was no longer enough to know the rules. One had to understand their purpose, and to judge when that purpose was served by following them closely, and when it might be better served by adjusting them. For some women, this process felt natural, even empowering. It allowed for a more flexible engagement with the world, a way of maintaining social coherence while also responding to new opportunities. For others, it introduced uncertainty. Without a single, stable framework, each situation required interpretation, and interpretation carried risk. The presence of that risk meant that even as behavior became more adaptable, caution did not disappear. A woman might choose to speak more directly in a particular setting, but she would still be aware of how that directness might be perceived if carried into a different context. She might relax certain formalities among trusted companions, but she would be careful to maintain them where reputation was more immediately at stake. This careful navigation created a kind of layered identity. Outwardly, a woman could still appear fully aligned with the expectations of her social world. Inwardly, and in selected contexts, she might operate with a greater degree of flexibility and independence. The two were not necessarily in conflict, but they required ongoing management to remain in balance. At the same time, the visibility of these differences, however subtle, began to influence the collective understanding of what was possible. When one woman adjusted her behavior successfully, without negative consequence, it suggested that others might do the same. Over time, these individual choices contributed to a broader shift in perception, expanding the range of what could be considered acceptable. This process did not move evenly across all areas of etiquette. Some aspects remained more resistant to change than others. Formal occasions, as before, tended to preserve established forms with greater rigidity. The rituals of high society, dinners, receptions, ceremonial visits, continued to operate with a high degree of structure, offering a sense of continuity that many still valued. But in less formal, more fluid environments, the changes became more noticeable. The pace of interaction quickened slightly. The tone of conversation became, in certain contexts, more direct. The boundaries between different kinds of relationships, social, intellectual, professional, became less clearly defined. These developments did not eliminate the importance of etiquette. Instead, they redistributed it. Rather than governing every detail of behavior, etiquette began to focus more on the maintenance of general principles. Respect, awareness, consideration for others. The precise forms through which those principles were expressed became more variable. And yet, even as this redistribution took place, the older expectations did not simply fade away. They remained present, sometimes quietly, sometimes more forcefully, depending on the setting and the individuals involved. This coexistence of old and new created a kind of layered social landscape where different versions of etiquette could operate simultaneously. For women navigating this landscape, the challenge was not only to understand each version, but to move between them without disruption. A single day might require shifts in tone, in formality, in expression, as one moved from one environment to another. Each shift had to be managed carefully, so that no single aspect of behavior appeared inconsistent or out of place. This constant adjustment required energy, but it also fostered a deeper familiarity with the underlying mechanics of social interaction. Women became not only participants in the system, but interpreters of it, reading its patterns, sensing its limits, and, in small but meaningful ways, contributing to its evolution. And it is through this process of interpretation and gradual adjustment that the next phase of Edwardian etiquette begins to emerge, not as a clearly defined transformation, but as a growing awareness that the balance between tradition and change is no longer something that can be maintained entirely through quiet adaptation, but may eventually require a more visible rethinking of the rules themselves. And when a system reaches the point where quiet adaptation no longer feels entirely sufficient, what follows is not usually a sudden break, but a gradual shift in where authority itself is located. In earlier phases of Edwardian society, the authority of etiquette rested largely outside the individual. It was embedded in tradition, reinforced by family, reflected in social expectation, and quietly upheld by the collective gaze of others. A woman learned what was correct, and her task was to align herself with that standard as consistently as possible. But as the balance between tradition and change became more difficult to maintain, something subtle began to move inward. Authority did not disappear, but it became more distributed. Women still looked outward to established forms, to the behavior of others, to the expectations of their social circles, but they also began, more consciously than before, to rely on their own judgment in deciding how those expectations should be applied. This did not mean that etiquette became a matter of personal preference. The external framework remained powerful, and deviation still carried consequences. But within that framework, there was a growing space in which individual interpretation mattered. A woman might ask herself not only what the rule required, but what the situation truly called for, and whether those two things aligned. In some cases, they did. The established forms continued to function smoothly, providing clarity and ease. But in others, the answer was less straightforward. A situation might call for a response that felt slightly at odds with the traditional approach. More direct, more immediate, more openly engaged. In those moments, the decision could not be made by rule alone. It required judgment. This gradual shift toward internal judgment changed the experience of etiquette in a quiet but meaningful way. It introduced a sense of responsibility that went beyond simple adherence. A woman was no longer only responsible for following the rules, but for understanding them, understanding their purpose, their limits, and their appropriate application. And with that responsibility came a different kind of awareness. Instead of seeing etiquette as a fixed structure to be navigated, women began to see it as something that interacted with their own choices. The rules still shaped behavior, but behavior also, in small ways, shaped the rules. This reciprocal relationship became more visible in moments where women consciously adjusted their conduct to suit new realities. A woman involved in organized work might choose to speak more directly in that context, not as a rejection of etiquette, but as an adaptation of it. She might maintain composure and respect, but allow for a degree of clarity that would previously have been softened. If that adjustment proved effective, if it allowed the work to proceed smoothly without damaging her standing, it could be repeated. And if others observed that it worked, they might adopt similar adjustments. In this way, change did not spread through formal declaration, but through demonstration. At the same time, the boundaries of acceptability were still being tested. Not every adjustment was received positively. Some were met with discomfort or quiet disapproval, particularly in circles that held more tightly to established norms. This variability meant that each decision carried a degree of uncertainty. What worked in one context might not translate easily to another. This is where the role of social awareness became even more pronounced. Women had to read not only the situation, but the expectations of those around them, the flexibility of the environment, and the potential consequences of their choices. This reading was rarely explicit. It was based on observation, experience, and an accumulated sense of how different settings operated. And as this awareness deepened, it began to influence not only behavior, but perception. Women who demonstrated the ability to navigate these complexities effectively could be seen as particularly capable, not simply because they followed the rules, but because they understood them. Their conduct suggested not only refinement, but judgment. This distinction between following and understanding marked an important development. It indicated that etiquette was no longer only about conformity. It was also about interpretation, and interpretation by its nature allowed for variation. At the same time, the presence of variation introduced new forms of comparison. If there is more than one way to behave correctly, then differences in approach become more visible. One woman's careful restraint might contrast with another's measured directness. One might emphasize continuity, another adaptation. Both might be considered appropriate, but in slightly different ways. These differences did not necessarily disrupt the system, but they did make it more complex. The idea of a single, uniform standard began to give way to a range of acceptable practices, each shaped by context, personality, and circumstance. This range was not unlimited, but it was broader than it had been before. And yet, even as this range expanded, the underlying expectations did not entirely disappear. The importance of reputation, the value placed on composure, the emphasis on awareness and restraint, all of these remained central. What changed was how those values were expressed, and how strictly they were tied to specific forms. This shift can be seen as a kind of quiet rebalancing. The visible structure of etiquette remains, but the weight of that structure is distributed differently. Less is carried by fixed rules alone, and more by the ability of individuals to apply those rules thoughtfully. It is within this rebalancing that the system begins to take on a different character. It becomes less rigid in form, but more dependent on judgment. Less uniform in practice, but more responsive to context. And as it does, it begins to reflect not only the traditions of the past, but the emerging realities of the present. And it is from within that reflection, where tradition and change are no longer simply in tension, but in ongoing dialogue, that the next stage of Edwardian etiquette starts to take shape. As the question shifts from how to preserve the system to how far it can evolve without losing the very qualities it was meant to protect. And once that question begins to take shape, how far etiquette can evolve without losing the qualities it was meant to protect, the system starts to reveal something even more delicate. Those qualities themselves are not entirely fixed. Because what etiquette claimed to preserve, grace, dignity, respect, social harmony, could be interpreted in more than one way. In earlier generations, these qualities had been closely tied to restraint, indirectness, and carefully controlled visibility. But as circumstances changed, it became possible to ask whether those same qualities might be expressed differently. Could clarity, for example, be a form of respect rather than a departure from it? Could a more direct tone, in certain contexts, be seen not as a breach of decorum, but as a sign of seriousness and sincerity? Could visibility itself, once managed so cautiously, become compatible with dignity rather than a threat to it? These were not questions that were openly debated in drawing rooms, but they were present in practice. They appeared in the choices women made when navigating new environments, in the slight adjustments of tone and behavior that signaled a different understanding of what it meant to be proper. And as these different interpretations began to circulate, etiquette itself became less about preserving a single model of behavior and more about maintaining a recognizable standard across a wider range of expressions. The emphasis shifted, almost imperceptibly, from exact form to underlying intention. This shift can be seen clearly in the way composure was understood. Traditionally, composure had meant a visible control of emotion, a steady, unbroken surface that revealed little of what lay beneath. But as women engaged more actively in public and intellectual life, composure began to take on a slightly different meaning. It could include clarity, responsiveness, even a measured form of passion, as long as it remained controlled and purposeful. In this sense, composure was no longer simply about stillness. It was about balance. A woman could speak more directly, express a view, engage with a subject, and still be considered composed, provided that her manner retained a sense of control and awareness. This redefinition did not happen all at once, nor did it replace the older understanding entirely. In many settings, the traditional model remained dominant. But in others, particularly those shaped by newer forms of engagement, the expanded meaning began to take hold. The same pattern can be observed in the idea of respectability. Earlier, respectability had been closely associated with adherence to visible forms, proper dress, proper conduct, proper association. These outward signs were taken as evidence of inner qualities. But as behavior diversified, it became more difficult to rely on appearance alone as a complete measure. Respectability began to include a consideration of intention and context. A woman's actions might be evaluated not only by how closely they matched established forms, but by how appropriately they responded to the situation at hand. This did not eliminate the importance of appearance, but it added another layer to how behavior was judged. And it is within this layering that the system's adaptability becomes most apparent. Etiquette, rather than resisting change entirely, began to absorb it, reinterpreting its own principles in light of new realities. The forms might shift, but the underlying goals, coherence, mutual understanding, a certain social ease remained. At the same time, this process of reinterpretation introduced new complexities. When principles can be expressed in multiple ways, the boundaries of acceptability become less clearly defined. What one observer sees as a thoughtful adaptation, another might view as a departure from standard. This variability required a continued attentiveness to context, to audience, and to the subtle cues that signaled how behavior was being received. For women navigating this evolving landscape, the challenge was not only to act appropriately, but to anticipate how different interpretations might arise. A choice that felt balanced in one setting might need adjustment in another. The ability to read these differences became an essential part of social skill. And yet, even as these complexities increased, there remained a persistent desire for clarity. The appeal of a stable, well-defined system did not disappear. Many continued to rely on established forms, finding in them a sense of certainty and ease that more flexible approaches could not always provide. This coexistence between those who leaned toward preservation and those who moved toward adaptation created a dynamic tension within Edwardian society. It was not a conflict in the dramatic sense, but a continuous negotiation, played out in countless small interactions. A conversation might reveal it in the difference between a carefully measured response and a slightly more direct one. A gathering might reflect it in the balance between formal structure and relaxed exchange. Even a written note might carry it in the choice between traditional phrasing and a more immediate tone. These differences did not necessarily disrupt the system. In many cases, they were accommodated, absorbed into the broader range of acceptable behavior. But they did signal that etiquette was no longer operating as a single, unified code. It was becoming, instead, a framework within which multiple approaches could coexist. And as that framework expanded, it began to raise a more fundamental question, not simply how etiquette should be practiced, but what it was ultimately for. Was its purpose to preserve a particular image of social order, even as that order became less representative of lived reality? Or was it to facilitate interaction in a way that could adapt to changing conditions while still maintaining a sense of coherence? This question did not have a single answer, and different individuals and groups responded to it in different ways. Some emphasized continuity, holding closely to established forms as a way of maintaining stability. Others leaned toward adaptation, allowing the system to evolve in response to new demands. And between these positions, most women found themselves engaged in a quiet, ongoing process of adjustment, drawing on tradition, responding to change, and, often without explicit intention, contributing to the gradual reshaping of the very system they were navigating. It is from within this ongoing process that the next stage of Edwardian etiquette begins to emerge, not as a clear departure from the past, but as a deepening of the dialogue between what had long been expected and what was increasingly becoming possible, a dialogue that would continue to unfold in ways that were both subtle and, at times, quietly transformative. And as that dialogue continued to unfold, quietly, unevenly, and often without being named, it began to influence not just how etiquette was practiced, but how it was experienced. Because once a system becomes something you actively negotiate, rather than simply inherit, your relationship to it changes. Etiquette was no longer only a set of expectations pressing inward. It became something women moved within, adjusted, interpreted, and, at times, gently redirected. This shift becomes particularly clear when we look at moments of deliberate choice. Those instances where a woman, fully aware of the expected form, decides to follow it precisely, to soften it slightly, or to depart from it in a controlled way. These decisions were rarely dramatic. They often appeared as small variations. A more immediate reply, a slightly extended conversation, a willingness to remain present in a setting that would previously have required withdrawal. But what makes these moments significant is not their visibility, but their intention. They suggest that etiquette was no longer operating entirely on instinct or habit. It was being considered, weighed, applied with purpose. And once behavior becomes purposeful in this way, it begins to reveal something about the individual behind it. Two women might follow the same rule, but for different reasons, one out of adherence to tradition, another out of a conscious decision that the rule still serves the situation. The outward action appears identical, but the internal relationship to that action has shifted. This difference, though subtle, begins to shape the texture of social interaction. Conversations may carry a slightly different tone, not because the words have changed, but because the intention behind them has. A gesture of politeness might feel warmer, more considered. A moment of restraint might feel more deliberate, less automatic. At the same time, this increased awareness could also introduce a new kind of hesitation. When every action involves interpretation, there is always the possibility of misjudgment. A woman might pause briefly before responding, not out of uncertainty about the rule itself, but about how best to apply it in that particular moment. This pause, though often invisible, reflects the growing complexity of the system. It shows that etiquette is no longer simply guiding behavior. It is interacting with thought, with intention, with a more reflective understanding of social life. And this reflective quality becomes even more evident in situations where the stakes are higher, where reputation, opportunity, or personal connection are more directly involved. Consider, for example, the role of introductions and recommendations in a world where social networks were expanding. Being introduced to the right person could open new possibilities, whether in cultural, intellectual, or philanthropic circles. But the process of introduction still carried the weight of older expectations. It required a certain form, a certain endorsement, a certain level of confidence in the propriety of the connection. In such a context, a woman might find herself not only receiving introductions but facilitating them, deciding whether to connect individuals, how to frame that connection, and what it might imply. These decisions were not purely mechanical. They involved judgment and assessment of compatibility, reputation, and potential outcome. Here again, etiquette provided a structure but not a complete answer. The rules could guide the form of the introduction, but they could not determine whether it should take place. That decision rested with the individual, and it carried a degree of responsibility that earlier, more rigid systems might have minimized. This responsibility extended into the management of social boundaries. As interactions became more varied, the lines between acquaintance, friendship, and collaboration could become less clearly defined. A woman might interact with the same person in multiple contexts, each with its own expectations. Maintaining clarity within these overlapping roles required careful attention. Too much familiarity in one setting could disrupt the balance in another. Too much formality could create distance where cooperation was needed. The ability to navigate these overlapping relationships became a key part of social skill, and it relied on a deep understanding of how etiquette functioned across different contexts. And yet, even as this understanding deepened, the emotional dimension of these interactions did not disappear. In fact, it became more intricate. When behavior is carefully managed, when expression is shaped by both expectation and intention, emotion does not vanish. It is channeled that a gesture might carry more meaning because it is restrained. A moment of warmth might feel more significant because it is measured. Even silence can become expressive, suggesting thoughtfulness, consideration, or quiet disagreement. This layering of meaning adds depth to interaction, but it also increases the potential for misreading. When expression is indirect, interpretation becomes essential. And as we have seen, interpretation is never entirely controlled. This means that, despite the careful structure of etiquette, uncertainty remains a constant presence. It is managed, softened, and often concealed, but it does not disappear. And it is within this uncertainty that the system continues to evolve, as individuals respond to the outcomes of their choices, adjusting their behavior in subtle ways. Over time, these adjustments begin to influence not only individual interactions, but the broader patterns of social life. Certain approaches become more common, more accepted. Others fade or are reserved for more formal settings. The system shifts not through declaration, but through accumulation. And as this accumulation continues, it begins to shape the expectations of those entering the system anew. Younger women, observing the behavior around them, do not see a single, fixed code. They see variation. They see interpretation. They see the possibility of choice within constraint. This does not remove the pressure to conform, but it changes how that conformity is understood. It is no longer simply about matching a predefined model. It is about aligning with a range of acceptable practices, and doing so in a way that reflects both awareness and judgment. And it is here, in this emerging space of awareness, that the system reaches another quiet turning point. Because once individuals recognize that they are not only following etiquette but participating in its ongoing formation, the relationship between rule and behavior becomes more fluid. The rules still matter. They still guide, shape, and constrain. But they are no longer entirely external. They are part of a larger process, one that includes observation, interpretation, choice, and response. And as that process continues to unfold, it begins to extend beyond individual interactions into the wider structure of social life, where the cumulative effect of countless small decisions starts to influence not just how etiquette is practiced, but how it is understood, and what it is expected to do in a world that is continuing, quietly but unmistakably, to change. And as that understanding continues to shift, quietly but unmistakably, the expectations placed on etiquette begin to change as, well, not only in how it is practiced, but in what people believe it should accomplish. Because in its earlier form, etiquette had offered something very specific: predictability. It allowed individuals to move through social life with a sense of structure, a confidence that others would behave in recognizable ways. It reduced uncertainty by replacing it with form. But as the system became more interpretive, that predictability softened. It did not disappear entirely, but it became less precise. In its place, something else began to emerge, something closer to adaptability. Instead of relying solely on fixed patterns, social interaction began to depend more on responsiveness, on the ability to adjust in real time to the needs of the moment. Etiquette still provided a foundation, but it was no longer the entire structure. It became a starting point rather than a complete script. This shift is particularly noticeable in the rhythm of interaction. Earlier, social exchanges had followed a relatively measured pace. There was time to consider, to respond, to align behavior carefully with expectation. But in more dynamic settings, those shaped by new forms of activity and engagement, the pace could quicken. Decisions had to be made more quickly, responses offered with less preparation. In these circumstances, the essence of etiquette became more important than its exact form. A woman might not have the opportunity to construct a perfectly phrased reply or to follow every traditional step, but she could still convey the underlying qualities that etiquette valued: consideration, awareness, composure. These qualities, expressed through more immediate behavior, allowed interaction to remain coherent even when the form was less precise. At the same time, this emphasis on essence over form introduced a new kind of subtlety. Because when the outward structure becomes more flexible, the signals that guide interpretation can become less obvious. A gesture that once had a clearly defined meaning might now be read in multiple ways, depending on context and expectation. This increased ambiguity required a heightened sensitivity to nuance. Women had to attend not only to what was being said or done, but to how it was being received. A response that seemed appropriate in intention might need to be adjusted in light of the reaction it produced. This created a continuous feedback loop where behavior and interpretation influenced each other in real time. And yet, even as this loop became more active, the desire for stability remained. Many continued to rely on established forms as anchors, particularly in situations where uncertainty felt uncomfortable. Formal events, structured gatherings, and traditional rituals provided a space where expectations were clearer, where the older patterns could still be followed with confidence. This coexistence of flexibility and structure created a kind of layered experience. In some moments, etiquette felt fluid and responsive, shaped by context and individual judgment. In others, it felt solid and defined, grounded in long-standing practice. Moving between these layers required not only awareness, but a kind of ease, an ability to shift without drawing attention to the shift itself. For women who developed this ease, the system could become something they navigated with quiet skill. They could adjust their behavior to suit different environments, maintaining coherence across contexts without appearing inconsistent. This ability was not always visible, but it was often recognized. It signaled a depth of understanding that went beyond surface-level adherence. At the same time, the presence of multiple layers could also create moments of uncertainty, particularly for those still learning to navigate the system. Without a single, clearly defined standard, it could be difficult to know which expectations applied in a given situation. This uncertainty did not necessarily lead to error, but it did require attention, observation, and a willingness to adapt. And as this process of adaptation became more widespread, it began to influence not only individual behavior, but collective expectation. Over time, certain variations became more familiar, more accepted. What had once been a slight deviation might come to be seen as entirely appropriate, simply because it had been repeated and recognized. This gradual normalization of variation is one of the ways in which etiquette evolves without formal revision. The rules are not rewritten in a single moment. Instead, their application shifts through practice, through the accumulation of small changes that, taken together, alter the overall pattern. At the same time, there remained an awareness, sometimes explicit, often implicit, that not all changes were equally acceptable. Certain boundaries continued to hold, particularly those related to reputation and public perception. A woman might adapt her behavior within those boundaries, but stepping beyond them still carried consequences. This awareness maintained a degree of continuity within the system, even as other aspects became more flexible. It ensured that, despite variation, there was still a recognizable framework guiding behavior. The challenge lay in understanding where that framework could bend and where it remained firm. And it is in this careful negotiation between bending and holding that the lived experience of Edwardian etiquette becomes most vivid. It was not a system that simply dictated behavior, nor one that could be entirely reshaped at will. It existed in the space between, shaped by both tradition and response, by both expectation and interpretation. As this negotiation continued, it began to extend further into the structure of social relationships themselves. The ways in which people formed connections, maintained them, and allowed them to evolve were increasingly influenced by this more flexible understanding of etiquette. Relationships that might once have been defined by clear stages and formal boundaries could now develop in more varied ways, shaped by context, shared activity, and mutual understanding. The forms of interaction remained, but they were applied with a greater sensitivity to individual circumstance. And as these relationships grew more varied, they began to reflect a broader shift in how social life was organized, not as a fixed hierarchy of clearly defined roles, but as a network of connections that required ongoing interpretation and adjustment. It is from within this shifting network that the next movement begins to emerge, as the accumulated weight of these small, careful adjustments starts to influence not just how individuals behave, but how entire social patterns are understood, setting the stage for changes that will move beyond subtle variation into something more visibly transformative. And when those small, careful adjustments begin to gather enough weight, they no longer remain hidden within the quiet details of daily life. They start to reshape the surface itself. What had once been subtle variations, slight changes in tone, timing, expression become more noticeable, not because they are louder, but because they are more consistent. The balance begins to tip. The system that once depended on quiet preservation now finds itself sustained by quiet change. And yet, even at this point, Edwardian etiquette does not simply dissolve. It lingers not as a rigid code, but as a set of instincts. The habits of composure, the awareness of others, the instinct to soften rather than confront. These do not vanish. They continue to shape behavior, even as the forms that once carried them begin to loosen. This is what makes the Edwardian moment so quietly remarkable. It is not a story of sudden rebellion, but of gradual redefinition. The women who lived within the system did not all step outside it at once. Most remained within it, learning its language so well that they could begin, almost imperceptibly, to speak it differently. A carefully worded letter becomes slightly more direct. A conversation allows for a clearer opinion. A public appearance carries a touch more confidence. A decision is made with less hesitation than before. Each of these moments is small. On its own, it might pass unnoticed. But together, they accumulate into something larger, a shift not just in behavior but in expectation. And over time, that expectation begins to turn outward. What once required careful justification becomes more easily accepted. What once felt like a delicate adjustment becomes ordinary. The system adapts not because it is formally changed, but because it is lived differently. By the years just beyond the Edwardian period, this accumulated change becomes easier to see. The boundaries that once felt firm now appear more permeable. The language of etiquette is still present, but it carries different meanings. It guides rather than dictates, supports rather than confines. And perhaps most importantly, it begins to coexist with a growing recognition that dignity and clarity, restraint and expression, tradition and adaptation, these are not always in opposition. They can, in certain moments, reinforce one another. Looking back, it is tempting to see Edwardian etiquette as something distant and overly rigid, a world of rules that feel unnecessarily complex. But from within that world, those rules served a purpose. They offered structure, a shared understanding, a way of navigating a society that valued coherence and order. What changed was not the desire for those qualities, but the understanding of how they could be achieved. And it is in that quiet shift from fixed form to thoughtful application that the legacy of Edwardian etiquette really resides. Not as a static code, but as a process, a way of negotiating between what is expected and what is possible, between the weight of tradition and the pull of change. Even now, traces of that process remain. The instinct to adjust tone to context, the awareness of how actions are perceived, the effort to balance clarity with consideration. These are not relics. They are continuations, shaped by a system that once required such careful attention to the smallest details of human interaction. If you've been listening closely, you might notice how familiar some of these patterns still feel, even in a very different world. And it raises a quiet question worth considering. When you think about how people present themselves today, in conversations, in public, even online, which parts of etiquette have truly disappeared, and which have simply changed their form? If you've enjoyed this kind of calm, thoughtful journey through history, you might find there's always more to explore just beneath the surface.